Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Ezekiel Class. Good morning, all of you that are joining us online this morning. We welcome you. We pray the Lord is blessing you on this beautiful Sunday. We pray the Lord is working in your hearts as you study Ezekiel. We are on Ezekiel Class number 42, and this is probably not the most attractive topic that we're going to be into this morning, but we are into the Millennial Temple regulations. And we are going to go through it pretty quickly this morning. We're going to go through 38 verses this morning, but some of it may not be as attractive to some of you as some other areas that we've looked at. But I guess my thinking is if the Lord puts it into the Scriptures, we need to spend some time studying it and understanding what it is and why He put it in there. So we're going to be doing Ezekiel 44. Oh, I didn't write that up here. I've got last week's up there, pardon me. We're going to be doing Ezekiel 44, verse 4. Through 45, verse 8. And as I say, this is about the regulations of the Millennial Temple, and we'll try to go through this fairly quickly. We may actually get done a little early today, but we'll see how that goes. But feel free to ask questions as we go along. Okay, let's start with Ezekiel 44, verse 4. I'm going to read that for you first. It's in your handout for those of you that are here in the class. If you're online with us, please pull out your Bibles and open them up to Ezekiel chapter 44, and we'll look at verse 4. Now, Ezekiel is touring the Millennial Temple. Remember, this is the Millennial Temple here, and Ezekiel is touring the Millennial Temple, and an angel is bringing him through that temple, and it's referred to as the man. The man brought me by way of the north gate to the front of the temple. So he comes around here and over to the front of the temple, which is here at the east gate. I looked and I saw the glory of the Lord filling the temple of the Lord, and I fell face down. So he actually can see, even from out here, just the glory of the Lord has now come in. That was last week's class. The glory of the Lord entered. It's beautiful in there, and he's still way out here. And as he goes through it, we're going to see that it gets brighter and brighter and brighter. And just think about what that's like. The glory of the Lord is so great in this temple that he can see it from out there. He can see it from here. He can see it from outside the inner court, which would be here as he comes in. And just imagine what it would be like in the inner court, how much brighter and more beautiful it would be if it's so bright that Ezekiel has to fall down on his face. And imagine what it would be like if you get to the portico of the temple, which is over here, this area. Then imagine how much brighter it would be in the holy place, and then ultimately where Jesus actually is in the most holy place. That concept that the glory of the Lord just gets brighter and brighter and brighter as we see him would be amazing. And during the Millennial Kingdom, he will be there, and people will be able to see him. Some will be able to see him. Non-believers won't. We're going to talk about that today, but believers will be able to see him. A couple of times a year, we're going to be able to come in through here and come right to this. We're going to be able to come in through here and come right to this point here and be able to look in and see the glory of the Lord, and then go out down here. So a couple times a year, believers will be able to do that. Unbelievers will not be able to. They will just have to sacrifice at the temple. So that's verse 4. Let's move on to verse 5. Actually, we're going to do 5, 6, and 7 here. Well, let me do 5 first. The Lord said to me, Son of man, look carefully, listen closely, and give attention to everything I tell you concerning all the regulations and instructions regarding the temple of the Lord. Give attention to the entrance to the temple and to all the exits, and all the exits of the sanctuary. So Ezekiel's being told by the Lord to really pay close attention to all of this and relay it all out to the Jewish people and to us and to all of the people, so that people can really understand what the Lord is doing with the Millennial Temple. Well, if the Lord's telling Ezekiel to pay close attention, perhaps we should pay some attention to it as well, which is why we're going to spend perhaps more time than many people would like on this area. The Lord goes on to say in verse 6, Say to rebellious Israel, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Enough of your detestable practices, people of Israel. So bear in mind, this is written 2,600 years ago. And Ezekiel at that time is being given a view of the millennial temple that will happen at least 2,600 years in the future. It's even still in our future today. We don't know when it will happen, but it's still in our future today. So it's at least 2,600 years in the future. But Ezekiel is being told to go to the people of his time and tell them to change their detestable practices. Remember, at that time, they were still worshiping idols because the city of Jerusalem had just barely fallen, and many of the people were still into idol worship. So Ezekiel's telling the people to change their detestable practices, excuse me, so that they can understand this temple as it comes. Pardon me. When the temple comes, they will now be in a whole different type of practice than they were in at that time, but they will have to change over that 2,600 years. They actually have to change pretty quickly. Historically, by the time the 70-year captivity was done in Babylon, they had already changed tremendously, and when they came back, they were much better and much, much better than they had been previous to that. So the Lord goes on to talk about, now in verse 6, let me read you verse 6 next. In verse 6 the Lord says, "Say to rebellious Israel, this is what the sovereign Lord says, enough of your detestable practices, people of Israel." So the Lord is telling them, end your detestable practices, end your worship of idols and all the sinful behavior that you're doing, and seek the Lord, because the Lord, in order to get to the point where you can be here, you're going to have to be with the Lord if you want to come through that period of time and come to this. Moving on to verse 7, in addition to all your other detestable practices, you brought foreigners, uncircumcised in heart and flesh, into my sanctuary, desecrating my temple while you offered me food, fat, and blood, and you broke my covenant. So the Lord is saying, during this period prior to Ezekiel, you guys were really doing some bad stuff here. You were bringing foreigners in. You were bringing in Gentiles. Foreigners would be Gentiles. Uncircumcised in flesh would be Gentiles. Gentiles or Jews were circumcised in their flesh. Gentiles were not. There were some Gentile nations that did in those days, but most did not. So uncircumcised in flesh would be another term for Gentiles. Uncircumcised in heart is another term for non-believers. In other words, people who had not committed their heart to the Lord. So when he talks here about people who are uncircumcised in flesh and uncircumcised in heart will not be allowed into this temple. What he's saying is that to get within the outer walls of this temple, you must be a believer, first of all. And in those days, everyone will be circumcised as a believer. Everyone who is inside this temple, rather, will be circumcised as a believer. That's in order to get into the millennial kingdom, you have to be a believer. So the only people who won't be able to come inside the temple are people that are born in the millennial kingdom and choose not to accept Christ. Those will be the only ones not allowed inside the temple. So in order to see the glory of God, you need to be inside the temple, so the people who are not believers won't see the glory of God. It's kind of like us today, right? We don't really see God. We just have to trust in faith that he really exists. It'll be somewhat different then. Even though Christ is here and ruling the world and in person right here in Jerusalem, they won't see him. They will not see him. Just like we don't see him today. So they still have to believe based on faith. Now their faith's going to be a little stronger, or a little, not stronger, their faith's going to have a stronger basis because everybody around them is going to be saying, oh yeah, Jesus is right there in the temple. Once you believe, you'll be able to go in and see his glory. But until they do that, they're just going to have to take it on faith that that's really true. Questions on that?
Bob, the circumcision is not just physical, but it's also covenantal. That those who believe the covenant of love with God, and they're part of that covenant. So it's not, the physical represents the relationship.
Right. Well, he talked here about circumcision of the flesh and circumcision of the heart.
But even of the flesh was a sign of the covenant that God made with Abraham and his children.
Okay. I was taking the word flesh literally, so you're saying
that's true. It is literally, but it also those who were in covenant with God had to be circumcised as a sign of God's covenant with them. Right.
And that was Abraham. That was God's deal with Abraham.
And all the house of Israel after that.
Yeah. Okay. Let me go into verse 8. Instead of carrying out your duty in regard to my holy things, you put others in charge of my sanctuary. So the people of Israel, not only did they allow foreigners, Gentiles, into the temple itself, in the old temple, but they allowed people who were non-believers in, and they allowed people to come in and carry out other duties right next to the duties of the temple that were going on in there. So in the old temple, in Solomon's temple, just before this time, during the time of Ezekiel, you had the worship of God that was going on in there, but right next to it you had altars to idols, right inside the temple, right inside God's temple. Altars to idols were set up. That's how bad it got during the time of Ezekiel. And Ezekiel's being told here that has to change. God will not tolerate that ever again. That has to change. Verse 9 says, "This is what the sovereign Lord says, no foreigner, uncircumcised in heart and flesh, is to enter my sanctuary, not even the foreigners who live among the Israelites." So the Lord is saying, in this sanctuary, this new one, the millennial temple, no Gentile who is uncircumcised in heart or flesh may enter. Now, interestingly enough, I've looked at a whole bunch of translations here of that conjunction. Is it or is it and? What I read to you was and. There are many translations out there that translate it as or. That has quite a difference here, actually, because we're talking about people that are uncircumcised in their heart versus people who are uncircumcised in their flesh. Or are we talking about people who must be uncircumcised, or who must be circumcised, rather, in both heart and flesh? That would mean that certain people can't go in if it's and, who can go in if it's or. So there's a lot of controversy on that as to whether this refers to people who have physically been circumcised as well as people who are believers, or whether it just refers to people who either are physically circumcised or are believers. Understand the difference there. Okay, so let's move on now to verse 10. We're now moving to page 2 of your notes. I'm going to read you verses 10 through 14 here, and then we're going to talk about it a little bit. "The Levites who went far from me when Israel went astray, and who wandered from me after their idols, must bear the consequences of their sin." That's what we just talked about, right? "They may serve in my sanctuary, having charge of the gates of the temple and serving in it. They may slaughter the burnt offerings and sacrifices for the people, and stand before the people and serve them. But because they served them in the presence of their idols, and made the people of Israel fall into sin, therefore I have sworn with uplifted hand that they must bear the consequences of their sin, declares the sovereign Lord. They're not to come near to serve me as priests, or come near any of my holy things or my most holy offerings. They must bear the shame of their detestable practices, and I will appoint them to guard the temple for all the work that is to be done in it." So he's talking here, we talked earlier about the priests of Zadok as opposed to the ordinary Levites. Going all the way back to the time of David, the priests of Zadok stayed loyal to David. They protected the ark, they protected the area where the ark was kept. They stayed loyal to David when he was fighting against Saul. And later on, they stayed loyal to Solomon and some issues that he had with some other folks. So the priests of Zadok, as far back as the time of David and Solomon, set themselves aside. That was when Zadok lived, was in the times of David and Solomon. They set themselves aside as priests who were above other priests, not in rank, but in terms of their commitment to the Lord. So the Lord understands that. And then during the period, the next 400 years, while the Jews were sacrificing to idols in the temple, the priests of Zadok didn't do that. The priests of Zadok did not allow that. Many of the other priests and Levites got involved in all these pagan practices inside the temple. The priests of Zadok didn't do that. Well, that all ended in 586 BC when the temple was destroyed. But here we are now, 2,600 years later, and God is going to reward the descendants of the priests of Zadok. People who are biologically descended from the priests of Zadok will be rewarded for what their ancestors did 2,600 years ago and 3,000 years ago. And people who didn't follow the priests of Zadok, people who were just ordinary Levites and didn't follow the priests of Zadok, are going to be, in essence, punished for that sin. Not punished in a physical sense, but punished in terms of not being able to draw close to the Lord. So as you think about the priests that are going to be in this temple, there are going to be some priests that are going to be out here that are going to be slaughtering animals as they're brought in. They're going to be up to their eyeballs in blood, and that are going to be dealing with the crowds, dealing with guarding the temple, dealing with various menial tasks, if you will. You know, bringing the animals in, bringing the dead bodies out, all the stuff, the menial tasks of dealing with the temple have to be done by Levites. And there are going to be some Levites that are going to be doing the menial tasks. They will be descended from the people who were the other Levites. They will not be descended from the priests of Zadok. The actual people who can do the sacrifices here at the altar and who can come into this area over here, and service the Lord over in here will be the descendants of the priests of Zadok. So the Lord is telling us that even 2,600 years later, he still remembers the sin of their ancestors versus the goodness of the ancestors of this priests of Zadok. So it's interesting. Sin has consequences, and that consequences sometimes can go down through many generations. I'm sorry?
That's what's happening in America. We're paying for some of the sins in the last 50 years. Yeah. It's coming down to...
Well, some of those we've been here for. Yeah, we've seen them happen as we've been here. Now, yeah, it is. The Lord, sin has punishment, and it has to be, that punishment has to be dealt with at some point. Other questions on that before we move on? So let's move on now to verse 15, and I'm going to do 15 and 16. But the Levitical priests, who are descendants of Zadok, and who guarded my sanctuary when the Israelites went astray from me, are to come near to minister before me. They are to stand up before me to offer sacrifices of fat and blood, declares the sovereign Lord. They alone are to enter my sanctuary. They alone are to come near to my table to minister before me and serve me as guards. So only the Zadok priests are allowed to offer sacrifices out here at the altar. All the other Levites can do all the other menial tasks around the temple, but only the Zadok priests can offer the sacrifices. Only the Zadok priests can come into this sanctuary, which I have blown up over here. So only the Zadok priests can come into the portico or the holy place, and on occasion some will be allowed to come into the most holy place. There is a table here that will be set up for the Lord's offerings, and every day that will be the Lord's offerings will go there. The very best of the stuff that's sacrificed will go there to the Lord every day, and the Zadok priests will be able to come in and deal with that table, put things on the table, take things off the table. There are lights in here, candles that will have to be lit and replaced as they burn down. Only the Zadok priests will be allowed to come in and do that. So that's what he's saying here. Only the Zadok priests, and these are people that are in our world today, or in our world in the future, but are descended from Zadok priests. Questions on it? Okay, let's go on to verses 17 through 19 next. When they enter the gates of the inner court, that's this gate right here, or this gate, to come into the inner court. So when they enter the gates of the inner court, they are to wear linen clothes. So the Zadok priests are to wear linen clothes. They must not wear any woolen garment while ministering at the gates of the inner court or inside the temple. They are to wear linen turbans on their head and linen undergarments around their waists. They must not wear anything that makes them perspire. When they go out into the outer court, that would be out here, where believers can be, ordinary people, but believers. When they go out into the outer court where the people are, they are to take off the clothes they have been ministering in, and are to leave them in sacred rooms and put on other clothes, so that the people are not consecrated through contact with their garments. So there's a lot in there. Let's talk about that. First of all, why does the Lord require his priests that can come near him to wear linen as opposed to, say, wool? Interesting question. We don't exactly know the answer. The Lord does say here that wool will make them perspire, and perspiring, if you go back to the book of Leviticus, can make you unclean if you are serving in the temple. So he does say that wool can make you perspire, and those of us that have worn wool know it's pretty warm, and you can get a little warm wearing wool. One of the interesting things about wool, one of the interesting properties is that it sucks the moisture out of your body and contains it within the wool, so it's not up against your body. But why linen? And people have discussed this and argued about it. We don't know the answer. The scripture doesn't give us the exact answer. But possibly the answer is that linen is one of the very few materials that we wear that is not made from animal skin or animal products. Linen is made from flax. It is made from a plant. And if you go back to the Garden of Eden, to Genesis chapter 3, after Adam and Eve sinned, how did the Lord cover them? He covered them with animal skins. Maybe what the Lord is saying here is, if you're going to serve in my temple, you can't be covered with animal products, animal skins. Maybe that's what he's saying. There are people who think that. I kind of think that's probably true, but that's just my guess of it. But that's a possible reason why they are required to wear linen. Linen is a very light fabric. It's easier in a very hot climate. Israel is a hot climate. So that might be another possibility, but raises some interesting questions.
Well, I think, too, that if you wear wool, which came from an animal, the animal probably wasn't pure. And now you're bringing an impure item into the temple.
That's a great point. Great point. I hadn't thought of that. That's a great point. Yeah, the Lord obviously wants his priests that are coming in, the Zadok priests, to be extremely pure and extremely clean. And I mean ceremonially clean, as in Leviticus type ceremonially clean. Then it says, when they go out into the outer court where the people are, they are to take off the clothes they have been ministering in, and are to leave them in sacred rooms and put on other clothes, so that the people are not consecrated through contact with their garments. So when the Zadok priests are done ministering, they have to take their vestments off and put them in rooms that are in here. There are also some other rooms in here that are for garments, and leave them there and change into regular street clothes. And then they can go out and see the people that are in the outer court. Remember, the people are only allowed, and these are only believers, are allowed in the outer court, which is out here. In the inner court, only the Levites are in there. So, and the non-believers are only allowed outside the temple. They're out there. So when the priests go out into this area to meet with believers in the outer court, they have to take those clothes off. And the Lord gives us the reason for that. He's afraid, not afraid, but he's worried that they will be consecrated through contact with garments of priests. So what does that really mean? Consecrated means kind of blessed, right? So why wouldn't God want the people to be blessed? And it goes back probably, again, it's not clear exactly what this means, but it probably goes back to the situation that Moses had when he went up to the burning bush, and he came back and his face was so bright that the people couldn't be around it. The people couldn't see it. So he had to put a veil over his face from there on in. Anytime, from the rest of his life, Moses had to wear a veil over his face whenever he saw God, because the people couldn't stand to look at that. Perhaps something similar is true here. Perhaps something happens to the priest's clothes when he's in there in the presence of God. Remember, it's really bright in here. It's the presence of God in here. Perhaps, and it's even brighter when you get in here. Perhaps there's something about his clothes that the people can't see, or they won't be able to handle it. That's possibly what the Lord is talking about here. It's not absolutely clear. Yeah, Mike.
You've got to remember the woman that just touched Jesus' garment.
Yeah.
Never touched him, just touched his garment, was healed.
Right. Yeah. So there might be some I don't know if magical is the wrong word, but some godly properties to those garments as they are serving the Lord. I mean, just imagine being in the presence of God and serving him in here, right? Being able to go in here and offer the sacrifices out front. And the clothes you wear are sacred clothes, and those clothes, ordinary people can't see those. They have to be put away. Stephen?
In the Coptic church in Egypt, you'll see that when they do the communion, behind the curtain, they wear white and linen.
Okay.
But when they finish, they put them away and they're wearing black outfit to be with the people.
Okay.
So they still separate that this is a holy place with the holy clothes that should not go on the outside. So the outside is separated in holiness from the inside.
Yeah.
That's what they do.
Well, years ago, Deb and I traveled in Israel, and there were certain churches that we went to over there, certain Catholic churches and some Orthodox churches as well, where we had to wear things that we called holy clothes. You had to wear different clothing to go inside. As for example, men couldn't go in shorts. Women had to have skirts that went down beyond a certain point on their legs. So most of the ladies, it was so hot, most of the ladies were wearing shorts up during the day, but they carried these skirts that they would put on when we went into the churches that required holy clothes. So that's kind of a similar concept. Yeah, right. Other questions on that before we move on? Let's move now to verses 20 through 21. They must not shave their heads or let their hair grow long, but they are to keep the hair of their heads trimmed. No priest is to drink wine when he enters the inner court. They must not marry widows or divorced women. They may not, I actually need to stop there. So the priests are not allowed to shave their heads. I don't know what they do if they're bald, but they're not allowed to shave their heads. They're not allowed to let their hair grow long. So there's a certain limit to that. God doesn't actually say X number of centimeters or something. They have to keep their heads trimmed. The hair of their heads have to be trimmed. So they can't just let it grow like crazy. They have to keep it trimmed. And no priest is allowed to drink when he's going to enter the court. So when a priest enters the court and is near God, he's got to be in complete control of his faculties. He can't be high on anything. He's not allowed to drink or anything like that. Now let's move on to 22 and 23. They must not, we're talking about priests again. They must not marry widows or divorced women. They may marry only virgins of Israelite descent or widows of priests. They are to teach my people the difference between the holy and the common, and show them how to distinguish between clean and unclean. So the priests, there are rules about what the priests, who the priests can marry. They can only marry, if they want to be a Zadok priest and be able to service the Lord in the temple. They can't marry divorced women. They can't marry widows even, except widows of priests. They're allowed to marry widows of priests. They can marry only, other than that, they can marry only virgins, and they must be Jewish, must be Israelite descent.
So there are no celibate Levites then? Unmarried Levites? I just wonder, I know what the
I don't know the answer. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. Are there, in Judaism today?
I haven't seen any, but...
I mean, are there people that can... Well, of course, we don't have a temple in Judaism today, so I'm wondering if the priests who served in the temple in Jesus' time had to be married, or if they didn't.
To my collection, yes.
Okay.
Because one of the issues, their descendants who run as Levites, they have to have children. So, and they descend from them and them and so on.
Okay. So maybe you have to be married to serve the Lord. I don't know. It sounds like you might have to. I don't know the answer to that. I do
just
not know.
that the Catholics are a little bit different in that area. But most of the traditions, all the priests.
Well, Paul talked about being single and the benefits of being single. So there was that piece, which is a different part of Christianity as well. Mike, you had a question?
How can there be widows of priests when nobody dies during the millennium?
Great question. Great question. I don't know. It would have to be at the start of the millennial kingdom. There might be some priests who got killed earlier, and their widows are now coming into the millennial kingdom as believers. That'd be the only place I could think of where it could be. That is a great question. I'm learning stuff this morning here too, as well. So thank you. Other questions on this before we move on? Okay, let's move on. In any dispute. Oh, by the way, just staying in verse 23 for a minute. The priests are responsible to teach the people the difference between holy and common and show them how to distinguish between clean and unclean. So the priests have a responsibility to educate the people on this. And so that would be part of their job as well. They have another job, though, in verse 24. In any dispute, the priests are to serve as judges and decide it according to my ordinances. They are to keep my laws and my decrees for all my appointed festivals, and they are to keep my Sabbaths holy. So here's some additional duties that priests have to do. They serve as judges in disputes between Jews. Remember, there's still going to be Jews in the millennial kingdom. They serve as judges in disputes among Jews. And they'll decide. So if people come in, but they'll decide it in accordance with God's ordinances, in accordance with what's in here and what's in Leviticus and what's in the Bible in general. So if people have a dispute, they'll bring it to the Zadok priests, and the Zadok priests will make the determination of what God's ordinances say. And it sounds to me like they're going to get it right. I mean, the way this is worded, God's going to make sure they get it right, is the way I would read the wording of what we just read. So it's not like they're going to say, yeah, I kind of guess and think this or that. I think they're going to get the right decision for the people. It also says they're responsible to keep his laws themselves. They have to keep God's laws themselves. In other words, they have to do what God requires. They have to keep his laws for all of his appointed festivals. And remember, there are only 2 appointed festivals in the millennial kingdom. That's Passover, and that's the Feast of Tabernacles. All of the others have already passed. We don't need this. We don't need to look forward to Christ's crucifixion. We don't need to look forward to the rapture. We don't need to look forward to Christ coming back. We don't need to look forward to the resurrection. All of those things which the festivals celebrated or pre-celebrated were all behind us now. So the only things that are still there are celebrating the Passover, which is getting out of sin, and celebrating the goodness of God, which is the Feast of Tabernacles. So those are the only 2 feasts that they'll still be celebrating. Those will be the only 2 holidays, if you will, in this time. And then the other thing they're responsible to still do is keep the Sabbaths holy. So they will still be responsible. So we will still have to keep a Lord's Day in the millennial kingdom. There will be 1 day a week, just like we keep it today. There will be 1 day a week that is the Lord's Day. Okay, verses 25. Let's see. I'm now on. What did I ask here? Verses 25 through 27 we're going to look at next. A priest must not defile himself by going near a dead person. However, if the dead person was his father or mother or son or daughter or brother or unmarried sister, then he may defile himself. After he is cleansed, he must wait 7 days. On the day he goes into the inner court of the sanctuary to minister in the sanctuary, he is to offer a sin offering for himself, declares the sovereign Lord. So there will be people dying at that point in the millennial kingdom. Those will be people who do not accept Christ by their 100th birthday. There will be people dying. And unless this person is a very close relative of the priest is not to defile himself. The priest is not to touch a dead body. This was true of priests back in Jesus' time as well. A priest is not to touch a dead body. So a priest is not to defile himself unless it's a very close relative, And if that's the case, he's allowed to defile himself, but then he's got to purify himself. And there's a purification ritual that's laid out in Leviticus. And he's got to do that within 7 days and then go back to the temple and offer a sin offering in the temple, just like the priest did.
This doesn't, I'm kind of like where Mike is, this doesn't kind of make sense that these family members are dying. And I can't believe that none of them believe in Christ.
Well, it doesn't say all of his family members are dying. It says if he has a family member, if he's not to touch a dead body, okay, there are people
Right.
dying around him.
Why would they
Unless-
be dying? It's
Well, yeah, but that's what I'm
millennial.
saying, why would they be dying?
They're dying because they didn't accept Christ by their
I can't
100th
believe a
birthday.
Christian family would not have any believers in it.
Why not?
There might be some. Don't we see pastors in our churches today who have non-believers in their family?
There's some.
I mean, you and I know Pastor Jeff's family has a bunch of non-believers in it that he's dealing with. I'm sure Pastor Brick's family probably has some non-believers in there somewhere. I don't know that. I said I'm sure. I'm not sure, but I would guess.
So he's got a Zadok priest that has a father or mother that dies.
Well, the father would probably be a Zadok priest.
Well,
yeah.
there you go. So
Yeah.
how could his father die?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't have a good
I mean,
answer for that.
the whole priestly line comes down through, from the father all the way down to, from grandfather, father, all the way down.
Yeah.
They have to be believers.
Well, I would think so. Certainly, I would imagine that a Zadok priest in this time that we're talking about is going to marry a believer. It says he must marry a Jew. That was clear from what we just read. It doesn't say it's got to be a believer, but I would guess he would. I can't imagine a Zadok priest not marrying a believer. So, if he married somebody who's under 100 and not a believer and that person died, then potentially he could have a spouse.
I still think there's something missing here.
Yeah.
It's not adding up.
The interpretation is not as clear. That's what I would say. That we need to kind of, seriously look at it and what it means.
So
Okay.
Bob, I wonder how much of this is a repeat of the original rules and laws that were given in Exodus and Leviticus?
A lot.
I got a reference Bible here, and I don't know what, but
Okay.
it says these laws in verses 22-31 were originally given to the God's people during the wilderness wanderings, recorded in the books of Exodus and Leviticus. It was on and on. So I wonder how much of this is just a repeat. I don't know.
Well, you're my expert on Leviticus. I'll tell you, Stephen is so much
Part of
deeper
the
in
point,
Leviticus
Bob, could be
than
that
I am.
Some of the schools don't believe that Ezekiel is really talking about.
Yeah.
So that would feed into that theory.
There-
that this is not really.
Yeah, I've mentioned a couple times in recent weeks that there are rabbis today who do not believe as much in Ezekiel because it seems to conflict with what's in Leviticus in places.
Yeah.
It seems to follow it pretty well, but it seems to conflict in certain places. And I've pointed a number of those out to you. I pointed out some of them last week, and it was, we have a bull on the first day and then 6 goats afterwards, whereas in Leviticus it's 7 goats or 7 bulls that get sacrificed. So there are some differences, and people who are really into the Jewishness of this might look at it and say, I don't really trust Ezekiel, I'd rather stay with Leviticus.
In all our lives, we have to live with some of these things that we would not know. It does not make sense to us that we get to have.
Sure.
So I think we have to live with that ambiguity sometimes. It's just part of our Christian life that we don't know for sure what it is.
Yeah, the Lord reveals more and more and more of the
Yeah.
Bible's meaning over time, and some of it we're not going to get until we get there.
It's just our American nature that we have to know the details and everything.
Yeah.
We have to know it all for sure. It's really.
Yeah, we're trying to figure it all out, and it can't
Yeah.
be totally figured out. So I'm trying to make sure we understand that as we go through. When I'm not totally certain about something, I probably pretty much try to tell you that.
Well, the other thing that I'm seeing in here is that there's no mention of women in this whole temple thing. And in the old temple, there was a women's court.
Yes.
There's no women's court.
I'm sure that women will be allowed in the outer court. This is the area of the people. To me, the people is men and women. The women will be allowed, I'm sure, in the outer court. Whether there's a specific area out here, as there is in the temple, or as there even today at the Wailing Wall, there's a Wailing Wall for women and a Wailing Wall for men. in Jerusalem.
But does that still carry in heaven, that women would not be able to go even though they are believers?
I see.
Going to have those kind of...
All I can tell you is I see nothing in here that says any of the Zadok priests are going to be women. I do not see anything in here that says
we're not
that.
just talking about women, Zadok, but the people who believe. So the women should be interested in being inside the temple if they are believers.
Obviously, there'll be women
and why
believers.
Would they be segregated in heaven while they're also segregated in our time here? That's what I don't understand.
Say that again. I didn't.
If you're in
get your
heaven,
point.
then there shouldn't be segregation between male and female. If we're, all of us are believers.
Right. I agree.
But in the Old Testament, there's still within the temple theology.
And in the
women are
millennial
segregated.
temple, it sounds like there will be still.
Yeah, that's where I'm.
Sorry, that's.
It's not your fault. It's just the way.
It's what's in here, right? It's what the Lord
Where's
put
the
in there.
diversity law?
I'm sorry. I didn't hear.
What did
Okay.
you say? I didn't hear that.
Moving right along. If you expect me to know everything, you've come to the wrong class. Okay. Let's do verses 28 through 31 next. I am to be the only inheritance the priests have. You are to give them no possession in Israel. I will be their possession. They will eat grain offerings, sin offerings, and guilt offerings, and everything in Israel devoted to the Lord will belong to them. The best of all the firstfruits and of all your special gifts will belong to the priests. You are to give them the first portion of your ground meal so that a blessing may rest on your household. The priest must not eat anything with a bird or animal found dead or torn by wild animals. So this is more regulations about the priests. The priests can't own anything. They cannot own any property. That's always been true. By the way, the Levites were the only tribe that didn't have a specific area of the country. The other 11 all had specific territory. The Levites didn't. So priests cannot own anything. They get their sustenance because... Did we just lose that? Okay, I guess not. Okay. I saw the thing fall off the table. Just leave it. Just leave it. It's staying on. I'm good. They get their sustenance by what they eat, which has been sacrificed to the Lord, and then they're certain of that stuff they're allowed to eat. There's certain of the stuff that's sacrificed to the Lord, some of that the priests are allowed to eat. So that's where they get their food from. And the people make donations to the temple so they can get their garments and they can, get other stuff they need for life. So priests will still have those kind of rules, and they had that in the Old Testament as well. Priests did not own things in the Old Testament. And then it also says the priest can't eat anything that hasn't been sacrificed. So they can't, if they find a dead animal laying on the ground, they can't eat that. Or if the animal is killed by another animal, or if it's run over by a car or whatever, they can't eat that. They can only eat animals that have been sacrificed in the temple. Now, that brings us to the end of chapter 44. I want to get into chapter 45 next, which is about, we're going to begin the land division of the Lord's area here. When you allot the land as an inheritance, you are to present to the Lord a portion of the land as a sacred district, 25,000 cubits by 25,000 cubits. That is this area here. This will be the land. This is a map of the land, by the way. By the way, this is the Jordan River. This is the Mediterranean Sea out here. And in the middle of Israel, there's going to be a square, 25,000 cubits by 25,000 cubits. Remember, a cubit's about... Let's see, so 25,000 cubits would be about 43,000 feet long, about 8 miles by 8 miles around. Of this section, a 500 cubit square is to be for the sanctuary, so that's right in the middle is the temple. 500 cubits by 500 cubits, it's a square. And around it, with 50 cubits around it for open land. So there's going to be a small patch of open land around it that nobody can build on. That's area that surrounds God's temple. This is the temple. This is this here, right? So this is going to be in the middle of this area. In the sacred district, measure off a section 25,000 cubits by 10,000 cubits wide. It will be the sanctuary, the most holy place. It will be the sacred portion of the land for the priests who minister in the sanctuary. That will be the Zadoks, and who draw near to minister before the Lord. It will be a place for their houses as well as a holy place for the sanctuary. So in here, this special area in Jerusalem is going to have 3 sections. The middle one is for the Zadoks, and that's going to be where the Zadoks will live. They'll have their homes in here. They'll build their homes in this area, and they will, of course, serve at the temple here. So it's going to be right in the middle of this area, and that's 25,000 by 10,000 cubits. An area 25,000 cubits long and 10,000 cubits wide will belong to the Levites who serve in the temple as their possession and towns to live in. So there's another area up here where the Levites, the people who do the manual labor in the temple, who handle the animals for sacrifice and handle the dead bodies and the blood and all that stuff, they will live in this area up here, and that will be their area to build their homes in. You are going to give the city as its property an area of 5,000 cubits by 25,000 cubits long. It will belong to all of Israel. So Jerusalem will be in here, and this area will be 5,000 cubits wide by 25,000 cubits long. So it's about 8 miles long, and it'll be about 2 miles wide. And this is where the people will be able to be. Now, the people will be in other places too. We haven't talked about that. The tribes are going to own this other stuff, the various tribes of Israel. But this will be an area for the people, and the city of Jerusalem will be right in the middle of that as well. So that's that other square, is the city. The prince will have the land bordering. The prince, remember, is Prince David. The prince will have the land bordering each side of the area, formed by the sacred district and the property of the city. It will extend westward from the west side and eastward from the east side, running lengthwise from the western to the eastern border parallel to one of the tribal portions. This land will be his possession in Israel. And my prince, let me stop there. So the Prince David, is going to have his lands here, where he's going to be able to grow things, raise animals for sacrifice. As we're going to see as we get into this, Prince David is going to be putting up sacrifices for people who can't afford it. So he has to have some resources to be able to do that. He has to have some money in today's thing. So he's got to have a place where he can raise some cows and some lambs and whatever that can be used for sacrifice. These will be his areas here that will belong to him. Nobody else will be able to do anything in there. And then the last verse, the last part of the last verse says, "And my princes will no longer oppress my people, but will allow the people to possess the land according to the tribes." So we're going to have good government in that time. Today our princes, our leaders, oppress the people, right? You see it all around the world. You see it in our country as well. The people who get power, either through elections or seizing power or fighting wars or whatever, use that power to oppress the people. That won't happen anymore. That will not happen in the millennial kingdom. The princes will not use their power to oppress the people, which is great. That's good news for us to hear. Other questions regarding this? It's a tough lesson today. Sorry for that. We don't normally dive this deep, but if the Lord put 38 verses in here in the Bible, we need to at least spend a little time talking about what's in there. So next week I think it'll get a little better as we get into some new stuff. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, folks at home, for joining us, and we pray you will all have a blessed week in the Lord, and we'll see you all back here next week.